All right, we're going to get started. Okay, let's call to order, please.
Order, everyone! Whoa!
An announcement before I start.
Really fast.
The conversation's over.
Some things from the party last night that were left. A North Face jacket, fleece, black. Anyone know whose it is? Bianca's?
I got this orange stiletto.
This scarf.
Oh!
It's alcohol sword.
Okay.
No, he's
Well, no,
he
he's
left
going to the
airport.
airport. Here, give it to me.
Give it to somebody who's in New York.
Yeah.
And finally, this bag with a Cleveland State NCAA soccer first round Michigan State University tag on it.
Bud Bucks.
Let's open it up. See what
Storm force in
Well, whose is it?
Bianca's.
DJ was from.
Crack it open, man.
Okay. If it's a DJ, I can give it back to Morgan.
What bottles are in?
Yeah.
Who was the DJ last night? He's from Cleveland.
Okay, then it's probably this. So
It's the
I'll give
DJ?
it to Morgan, and she can get it back to him in that case. All right.
can see if the remnants of the
All right, so in the tradition of our annual conference, I'm going to give the public president's report on a theme that was selected by the organizational committee, and that is 1914 in the history of Marxism, because this is, of course, the centenary of World War I beginning in 1914. So let me just jump right in so that we can get some discussion. 100 years later, what does the crisis and split in Marxism and the political collapse of the major parties of the Second International in 1914 mean for us today? The Spartacists, for example, are constantly in search of the August 4th moment, the moment of betrayal of the proletariat struggle for socialism by various tendencies in the history of Marxism. They went so far as to confess their own August 4th moment when they failed to call for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake there. So they had an article on the earthquake in Haiti, and then a couple of weeks later they said, we had our August 4th moment because we didn't call for the immediate withdrawal of the troops. So what happened from a Marxist perspective on August 4th, 1914, when the SPD members of the Reichstag voted to finance the Prussian Empire's war budget? Two things. One, the parliamentary representatives of the SPD went against the past resolutions to vote against the war effort by the German government. And two, the disorganization of the SPD leadership, what has been called the effective but illegitimate takeover of the party by its parliamentary delegation. No legitimate political authority of the party sanctioned the action of voting for the war credits. In all respects of principle and practice, therefore, the SPD was destroyed as a political organization as it had existed up to that point. August 4th, 1914 has been called, by the Spartacists, for example, the first great internal counter-revolution in the history of Marxism. This is entirely true. But it was a counter-revolution conducted not merely by the leadership of the SPD, however they may have abetted it, but rather by the Reichsgovernment against the SPD membership. What was the specific character of this counter-revolution, and how was it made possible? There was a famous pair of sayings by the SPD's chairman, August Bebel, who, however, died before the war in 1913. The two statements are, "Not one man or one penny for this rotten system," and, "If it's against Russia, I myself will pick up a gun." The German High Command, in preparation for war, took aim precisely at the contradiction between these two statements by Bebel. The German High Command wielded the specter of counter-revolution through potential occupation by Tsarist Russian troops against the SPD, in order to prompt their preemptive counter-revolution, which they saw as an act of self-preservation, as the lesser evil. Just to explain that a little bit. So basically they said, well, if Russia defeats us in the war, they'll occupy Germany, and of course they'll destroy the SPD in the process. Furthermore, they thought that getting behind the war, the SPD, getting behind the Prussian Empire's war, would allow them to somehow control the war, to make the government dependent on them, and so potentially wrest political concessions from it, perhaps even undermining it in political favor of the proletariat. This was not an unreasonable judgment on the part of the SPD. The question is whether their compromise was too much, whether the act of ostensible self-preservation was in fact actually an act of self-destruction. The SPD leadership did not want the war. They thought, however, that they couldn't prevent it. Unleashing a class struggle civil war to stop the international war was not feasible, to their mind, in terms of success, but would only result in the crushing of the SPD's organization, which was at least preserved, if subordinated, to the government through the war. So the issue is what was preserved through the compromise, the surrender to the blackmail of the war. The German government, which the original Spartacus League of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht considered, rightly so, responsible for World War I. In other words, they said it's the German government that's responsible for the war. In other words, they didn't say it's the British government that's responsible for the war. It's the German government that's responsible for the war. That German government adopted a strategy of a two-front war against both the Russians and the British and the French, despite the evident military risks of doing so, but in order to assure the adherence of the Social Democrats to the war effort, out of defense against the Russians. The threat of Russian invasion and occupation, the destruction of the Social Democratic Workers' Movement, was enough to preempt such active counter-revolution with the passive counter-revolution of the Social Democratic cooperation with the war. In all politics there is, as Lenin put it, a who-whom question. Who is the agent and who is the object? The most catastrophic political mistakes that the left has made historically is in terms of this who-whom question and problem. For instance, the Iranian left tried to use Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamists, but rather it was Khomeini who used the left in the Islamic Revolution. The German Social Democrats, by contrast, did not seek so much to undermine the German government through cooperation, but rather merely to survive the war. Still, when the German war effort collapsed in 1918, the Social Democrats were, as a result of their collaboration, in the position to have the mantle of government fall to them, in what they considered to be a democratic, but not socialist, revolution. The apparent separation of the democratic from the socialist revolution in 1918 is what retrospectively condemns the SPD's collaboration with the German government in 1914. What confirms the political character of the vote for war credits of August 4th, 1914, was the counter-revolutionary role played by the SPD in 1918 to 1919. If the SPD had fought for socialism in 1918, then its choice to avoid confrontation and repression in 1914 would have been justified. It was not only the horror of the war that indicted the SPD's compromise of 1914, but rather the division around the struggle for socialist revolution later, at the conclusion of the war, that confirmed Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and Lenin's perspective. However, there was the perspective of Kautsky, somewhat different, who was consistent in considering the war an utter calamity and not any kind of occasion for struggling for socialism, either in 1914 or in 1917 or in 1918 and 1919. Kautsky condemned the Bolsheviks' overthrow of the Russian Provisional Government in 1917. That provisional government had stood with the Entente, with the British and the French, against the Germans. Lenin and Trotsky's Bolsheviks, on the other hand, were regarded by Russian nationalists as German agents for promoting an armistice. So what I'm pointing out here is the sort of paradoxes involved in the different positions on the war. Because they promised to pull Russia out of the war, Lenin and Trotsky were seen as agents of Germany, and yet Kautsky, who had voted for war credits, condemned their overthrowing the provisional government that supported the Entente against Germany. So it's not that Kautsky was just a German defensist consistently. He wasn't. That's important to note. But Lenin wanted to pull Russia out of the international war precisely in order for Russia to then participate in the civil war between the global classes of workers and capitalists. So that's what changes it. Thus, Kautsky and Lenin could accuse one another of complicity in the war and betrayal of socialism. Kautsky for voting for war credits to defend the SPD in the present, and thus the possibility of a struggle for socialism in the future, and Lenin for trying to use the war as an occasion for socialist revolution. Each could accuse the other of opportunism in the historical moment, and of undermining and betraying the true struggle for socialism. Luxemburg agreed with Lenin that in itself, and apart from the immediate application of the goal in the struggle for socialism, the SPD was nothing, or indeed worse than nothing, part of sustaining capitalism. For Luxemburg and Lenin, the SPD was duty-bound to launch a civil war against the German government rather than allow it to launch an international war. This is precisely the repression of the SPD Kautsky and other leaders of the SPD feared, why they thought it was impossible to stage a political confrontation with the government in 1914. Its failure to do so rendered it, in Luxemburg's terms, a stinking corpse, that is, something that had already been dead for a long time. So that it had already been putrefying by August 4th, 1914. August 4th revealed the SPD as already dead. Its past failures accumulated in August 4th. This was not a matter of mere tactics, a military appraisal of the SPD's chances against the government and its forces in 1914, but rather a matter of principle, preserving the honor of Marxism and of the workers' movement for socialism more generally. Recently, the anarchist Wayne Price spoke on a platypus panel about the dual failure of Marxism in the Second and Third Internationals, that Marxism revealed its authoritarian statism at two clear moments: when Marxists of the Second International supported the war in 1914, and when Lenin suppressed other socialists in the Russian Revolution, and Stalin did so in the Spanish Civil War. The role of Marxist parties in these instances was to serve the counter-revolution rather than the revolution, in this view. The question then would be not what Kautsky and Lenin had in common, but rather how they differed, and they differed most clearly around the issue of the war in 1914, from which their later difference over the revolution in both Russia and Germany in 1917 and 1918 was derived. The question is the character of the workers' movement for socialism. Kautsky considered it an end in itself in 1914, thus retroactively agreeing with Bernstein's revisionist reformist view of the movement is everything and the goal is nothing. Preserving the movement meant betraying its goals, whereas Luxemburg and Lenin were willing to sacrifice the movement for the goal of socialism. That is the only reason that they opposed the war, by opposing the war policies of the various antagonistic governments to precipitate a global civil war of workers against capitalists. They thus did not reject the war on pacifist grounds, as Kautsky might have done, compromising with it on defensive grounds, but rather identified the war as the necessary expression of an occasion for the need to struggle for socialism. As it turns out, perhaps the preemptive counter-revolution by the German government through the war must be deemed in retrospect to have been successful. Certainly the struggle for socialism, let alone Marxism, in the advanced capitalist countries never did recover from it. Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky tried to make the First World War really into what Woodrow Wilson merely promised, that is, a war to end all wars. Wilson thought that it was to defeat feudalism, the remnants of feudalism, the Prussian Empire. Marxists understood rather that it was to overcome capitalism, in other words, the war to end all wars. As such, they launched a civil war, first and foremost a civil war within Marxism itself, between those who accepted the task and those who rejected and thus betrayed the duties of that civil war. That they failed in this, Lenin and Luxemburg, is not proof against the task of socialism. Woodrow Wilson, US President Woodrow Wilson, regarded and fought against the Marxists as extremists. He was part of the intervention against the Russian Revolution. Extremists bred, rather, of the political repression of undemocratic states. In other words, the fact that there was a Marxist leadership of the Russian Revolution would have been chalked up to the pathology of Tsarism that came before it. But of course, the conservative and opportunistic character of Wilson's politics was different from that of the SPD's capitulation to the war. Or was it? Wilson didn't think that Prussian militarism or Tsarism indicted bourgeois society, but were rather backward violations of its norms. The SPD similarly addressed the war as an abnormality. In other words, Kautsky treated the war as an avoidable mistake, as an abnormality. Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky addressed the war, rather, as the norm. That is, the endemic crisis of capitalism raised to a fever pitch. But the SPD and Wilson considered them, Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, to be opening the world to greater war and greater horror, to the greater barbarization of bourgeois society. If Wilson was no socialist, he still considered himself a defender against the threats of both Prussian militarism and Bolshevism, against the norms of liberal democratic bourgeois society, which socialists considered the baseline minimum of the standards of a better society. The question and the political dispute was over how to best protect, defend, and promote the principles of that better society, to which all political actors might claim to have been adhering, and what compromises can be justifiable in that pursuit. It is not thus a matter of pure principles, but rather of the relationship of means and ends, which is the true dispute of politics. 1914 was not proof of the Marxist analysis of imperialism, or the demonstration of the horrors of capitalism, or any other such thing. It was the division of Marxism in War and Revolution at the Götterdämmerung of bourgeois society that haunts the struggle for socialism to this day. The task and duty of civil war from which the left today shrinks, thus becoming a stinking corpse now as before. The war and the revolution are all around us all the time. As Lenin put it, it is not as conveniently posed as the capitalists lining up on one side and the workers on the other side, which would make the task very simple. No. 1914 is still with us to the extent that the workers are on both sides, and both sides could plausibly claim to be on the true side of the struggle for socialism, or at least for a better society, which is what socialism after all means. 1914 was the division in the workers' movement for socialism, which was the precondition for the politics of revolution. The fact that we no longer have that politics can be traced back to the problem in question and task that 1914 revealed. Richard.
Okay, I actually, hearing your description, I actually found myself like wanting to protest on Lenin's behalf. Like I found like it was in some way to my ears like too generous to Kautsky. But what I guess what I was thinking about was two things. One is I think that the idea that we've inherited from 1914 is this Leninist notion of revolutionary defeatism. And while revolutionary defeatism is presented as Marxist orthodoxy, it really represents innovation of Lenin, right? And it was not even the norm among the people who opposed, like the Zimmerwald Center. It wasn't really the norm of the Marxists who opposed the war. And revolutionary defeatism came from a very acute insight, which was that 1914 simultaneously represented the overripeness of the rottenness of bourgeois society, but also the rottenness of the SPD. Now, the second part actually took Lenin, too, by surprise, right? Lenin was shocked by what the SPD did.
Probably more shocked than Luxemburg.
Probably more shocked than Luxemburg. But aside from the subjective psychology, the idea behind that, I mean, Marx and Engels really had an opportunistic view of the wars of their time. They did not take a revolutionary defeat.
Franco-Prussian War.
Franco-Prussian War, wars of Germany, they took different positions, different wars, depending upon how they tactically thought that it would help them. Right? Engels made a similar comment about a war against Tsarist Russia. Marx would have, again, those are tactical assessments, but the idea of a kind of principled revolutionary defeatism actually represents innovation on Lenin's part that represents a consciousness that bourgeois society has changed in the decade. It's the notion of imperialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
A new stage of bourgeois society. So,
But 100 years later, what about that?
okay, well, that's what I was saying. So Kautsky, I think, represented this sense of pure horror at 1914, right? And I think that kind of the neo-Kautskian CPGB line is kind of apologetic and dishonest about Kautsky, but leaving that aside. The problem with the Leninist view is that there is a period that opens up. And I would say actually the period is somewhat longer than it tends to be presented in the platypus narrative, which might be 5 years going to 1919, right? This notion, I would say in some ways it goes, the real end to the period is maybe 1933.
Trotsky himself would have thought that it might have gone until 1945.
He might have, but like I think that there's a way in which like one of the problems you see in terms of like later Marxist narrative is that the Second World War did not shape up in the way that the First World War had. That even people who upheld the banner of revolutionary defeatism didn't really believe it, right? The Trotskyists were not really revolutionary defeatists. So, and in then the post-1945 world, right, and particularly like the post-89, post-2001 world, the principle of revolutionary defeatism and its sort of concrete connection to a particular politics becomes sort of more and more detached. So what tends to be upheld is the principle, right?
Let me say something about this because I glossed it in a particular way and I thought about different ways of putting it, but I want to kind of put a finer point on it now that you're raising it, Richard, which is that on the one hand, Luxemburg and Lenin were on the same side in the war, and on the other hand, they were on opposite sides, meaning they were both revolutionary defeatists in certain respects. And that's why I highlighted that for Liebknecht and Luxemburg, they held the German government responsible for the war in a way that they didn't quite hold the French government and the British government. Now, whether they held the Russian government also responsible for the war and the Austro-Hungarian government responsible for the war as the junior partners of the Germans, sure. But one of the first critiques of the Bolsheviks in power by Luxemburg is a critique of their armistice with Germany, because Luxemburg thought that by doing this, that he would have been embracing German militarism, right? And that this is a real, we kind of forget about that now because we emphasize other differences between Luxemburg and Lenin, but actually that was like a live issue for her. Was that somehow the Bolsheviks shouldn't, sign an armistice. And we should also say that within the Bolsheviks, there was also a huge controversy over signing the armistice with Germany. It's also what broke up the left SR Bolshevik alliance in the revolution. It's what launched the Red Terror in response to the the Black Terror or the White Terror, however you want to call the left SR terror against the Bolsheviks. They blew up the Bolshevik party headquarters in Moscow, and they tried to assassinate Lenin and tried to assassinate the German ambassador immediately upon the armistice being signed. Anyway, so this whole issue that the left has now about imperialism and the duty to be against your own government and revolutionary defeatism and this kind of thing, the way 1914 is remembered, it's remembered at the level of principles in a particular way that I wanted to call attention to, and rather raise the issue of the principle of the need to split the workers' movement. Like, in other words, that really Lenin, his estimation of World War I was bound up with his estimation of the historical moment, we should also recall that Lenin's criticism of Luxemburg's Junius pamphlet was that it was too pessimistic. In other words, he read Luxemburg's Junius pamphlet and he thought, well, this is just painting too dark a picture. And which is interesting. In other words, basically what he was saying was, hold on, right? Like this might still play to our favor.
Okay.
In a way that she was much more despairing.
Right, and so in here, again, like I would say, like Lenin's perspective and the comment on the armistice, it's actually, I would say he had the clear insight into the actual historical situation. And I would, in this sense, be completely orthodox. And like even in terms of the armistice, it represents, again, like there was this phrase that Samir had about instrumental reason.
Uh-huh.
And I was like talking about technology, not about
Politics,
but there is in Lenin's judgment about an armistice a purely instrumental reasoning, which actually sidesteps like a kind of moralistic judgment about a principle. In other words, it's not about a principle, it's purely about a tactical assessment.
Well, it's not all right, I would say this, it's not a moralistic principle, but it is a principle of a kind, but of a peculiar kind. And that's where I tie it back to your first point, which is that it's a principled position with respect to an estimation of the historical situation.
Right, principled with respect.
It's not principled with respect to, war and peace, pacifism, militarism.
Right. In other words, like, and so I again, like I think that the problem. I mean, I'm one.
It's the nature of the principle of the Marxist opposition to the war that I wanted to highlight.
Right, but so I just wanted to bring up one other analogy, and then I'll shut up. So, like, one of the things that I was thinking about was the spark line on various Arab-Israeli wars, which was like a call for revolutionary defeatism for both sides. And since they didn't have like any organization, I guess they had briefly an organization in Israel, but basically they had certainly no organization.
In Egypt.
Like that call, right, has like a purely abstract quality, right? But there is behind that, right, as a principle, a way of thinking about politics that even just as a gesture speaks to something that is actually an insight,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember an interview with Israel Shahak, who was not a Marxist, was a sort of liberal critic of Israeli policy, Zionism, so he was actually a Holocaust survivor, and very popular on the left, somewhat problematic, but and he said, well, I know you're a revolutionary defeatist, and I don't call for that. Like, I didn't want either victory or defeat, right? Which is very similar, again, to sort of the logic of the Zimmerwald centrist. And implicit in that, of course, is the notion, well, in reality, you can't have, like, a revolution, right? And it's not necessarily clear that the Sparks like believe in the literal reality of revolution, but the gesture of speaking to the possibility of revolution is itself a kind of political analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what has been lost in the discussion about revolutionary defeatism is...
For instance, in their position on Haiti and the earthquake.
Right. In other words, it's sort of like, yeah, in terms of the discussion about hating the earthquake, which I really cannot imagine Marx and Engels' position that they would take
Or
that
Trotsky.
position.
Yeah.
It's the lack of thinking about about the possibility or not believing in the possibility of, this idea of a global class civil war. That possibility, that once that possibility recedes, the initial
It
logic,
changes everything. Yeah.
everything gets changed. And
Gregor and then Theo and then Jan.
Yeah, a comment and a question about the Wayne Price Pierce thing. I got a similar feeling from the panel discussion on the first International yesterday from John Becken, in which he sort of raised this very automatic, determinist interpretation of why sort of, I guess, Stalinism happened. And I had the feeling he wouldn't say that directly, and I actually did not ask him, unfortunately, about that. that, like Marxism has been disproven, like empirically. I think he spoke of it empirically, that through the fact of Stalinism, through the fact that the revolution failed and went awry. And so I wonder whether this weird anarchist perspective would be then that Marxism basically existed, that was actually the problem in the Second and Third Internationals, rather than having a very concrete analysis of the at times contingent factors, or of course also very conscious factors that led to this split in the SPD and the workers' movement. And so, I mean, what he also glosses over is that many anarchists joined like the Bolshevik Revolution at the time because they made the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a comment that I sort of associated with the panel yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, when you said 1914 is still with us because the workers are still on both sides, and sort of the Spartacists making out of that sort of like the need to position yourself on Haiti and so on. I wonder, could you like speak to how you would combine that with an understanding of sort of the left on Iraq, for example, that you mentioned earlier, that of course they knew that they wouldn't stop the war, but they thought that something like the left or like a revolutionary potential would come out of that. Whether or not there's actually a conscious or unconscious recognition that 1914 is still with us, is that something, or is that something that we would have to raise to consciousness for platypus? Because I wonder if that bad leftism of the anti-war movement, for example, like in our present, may have in the end some kind of recognition of this ongoing crisis, but what kinds of factors would then sort of stand in the way of this recognition? I hope I got that.
Yeah. I mean, thinking back, because it's come up a few times, and it will come up again in our internal members meeting later, about our phase of history that we're living through now versus where we started in the anti-war movement phase. You can imagine that I wrestled with this in my own mind a great deal. The 1914 question, excuse me, in the Iraq War. And, we should say a couple of things about this. A government going to war takes a huge political risk. It does. Even the U.S. attacking a much weaker country like Iraq, it takes a huge political risk. Meaning it could unravel the whole thing. It actually could delegitimate itself and unleash all sorts of problems. I think that the anti-war protests before the war in Europe as well as in the United States gave the left a false impression that there was a kind of a mass sentiment waiting to take advantage politically of the misstep that the governments were going to make in launching the war. But I think they overestimated it, because I think that going out and protesting against the war in 2003 did not have the content that the left wanted to attribute to it. And that the left itself was also bound up in the reactionary conservative character of the opposition to the war. In other words, that there was just a kind of a fear, right? Whereas the neocons could say, well, no, you can't be afraid of freedom. We're marching, right? But anyway, obviously, the situation is quite different. Meaning, in 1914, there's a Second International. The reason that I invoked Lenin's critique of Luxembourg in the Junius pamphlet, when he's basically saying, okay, comrade, calm down. It's not all going to hell. Just hold on. These governments are undermining themselves, and, revolution could still happen. Of course, that's not based just on the calamity of the war. It's based on his perceived strength of the Second International. Now, where Luxembourg might have been right against Lenin is her sense, because of course Lenin thought, well, the SPD is the strong thing. Luxembourg having a much more realistic sense that maybe the SPD was a kind of a paper tiger, a hollow, giant.
And just for
Yeah.
because you described Lenin as Luxembourg sort of in that situation, seeing the war as a proof for the necessity of socialism,
Mm-hmm.
so that their opposition wasn't just from pacifist grounds like Kautsky. So I guess like in the anti-war movement, for example, like most of the organizations like had only a very moralistic, pacifistic critique of it. But I wonder what about like the sectarian course? Like, I don't know. I'm sure that the RCP participated in anti-war protests.
Oh, huge!
Would-
World
would-
can't wait. Hmm.
Did they understand? Did they understand basically that sort of as another proof of necessity of socialism? Of course, in a way they did, but
But they
what-
understood it
was
through
there, like,
Stalinism.
anti-war
Yeah.
opportunism just basically to show that pacifism has revolutionary potential?
Not exactly. I mean, the RCP, just to inform you guys, so they were part of the main organizers of the anti-war movement. The ISO and the RCP were huge, and then the Workers' World Party and their various offshoots, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. These are the main organizers of the anti-war movement. And so they'd show up with their sound system and their rabble-rousers, and they would
They're banners of the world on fire.
yeah, banners of the world on fire, but they would say, and they're preparing for fascism
Right.
for hundreds of years. Like it was like
Disaster.
they would just intone it at such a level that you just be like, where did I just arrive? Like you're showing up an anti-war protest, and you're not sure whether you're at like again a monster truck rodeo, right? Because no, the intonation was just straight out of like a sporting event or something, except with this leftist language as its content. And so what did they think? Well, they thought that the war showed just how fascist the world really is, right? So it's just stuck in this kind of 30s communism and fascism. Like if you're not a communist, you're a fascist. And most people can fool themselves into thinking that they're not really living under fascism, but the war shows that you're really living under fascism. That was the mentality that they had. And so it's far degraded. In other words, it's sort of neither Luxemburg nor Lenin, right? Because again, what we can say about Luxemburg and Lenin, Luxemburg, was an eagle, according to Lenin, but Lenin had a cooler head throughout various points in history because they were comrades through a lot of different controversies, and he had a cooler head and a more realistic perspective, ultimately. And it's not because he was realpolitik, right? It's because of some kind of historical insight, and that's the point. Teo, Pam, Spencer.
Okay, because I don't want to lose the argument, because it was perhaps too abstract when you discussed it with Richard. So we're talking about 1914 in history, and the way 1914, the stance of Lenin, the revolutionary defeatism seemed untenable. For example, in the Second World War, the Trotskyists tried to keep this position. They looked ridiculous to the rest of the left, irrelevant. And if we continue the history, nowadays, for example, when there is a war, even the US against Iraq, to have a revolutionary defeatist approach seems also irrelevant and ridiculous, even by Leninists.
Can I say something about this? So let's say that the US government had utterly undermined itself in the war. Do we really think socialism would have been the result of that? In other words, let's say that they had been completely delegitimated, but there are hundreds of thousands of American troops in Iraq. Obviously, what would have happened would have been a military takeover of the US government. That's what would have happened. And it would have been popular, because it would have been, well, the only way we can defend the troops, like if Congress and the executive can't get their act together and stand behind the war effort, we have hundreds of thousands of American hostages in Iraq, and the only people who can save them are the military leadership. That's what would have happened if the US government had been rendered illegitimate during the Iraq War. It would have been a military coup, it would have been a state of emergency, it wouldn't have been socialist revolution, that's for sure.
Yeah, you can always see a world war as two blocks conflict, but you can also see it always as the strong against the weak. Germany would seem like the weakest in the First World War. Then in the Second World War, Hitler would seem like the real threat. His plan, for example, it's always possible to see a war as, for example, fundamentalism, Islamistic fundamentalism against US, like two blocks, two versions of world domination. And you can also always see as the weak country, the small country, and the strong country, and that is unfair. And also we can project this view of 1914 to 1905 perhaps. what did the SPD and the Marxists did back then, the Russia-Japanese war? Was SPD's position the same? Like it was an accident, this war? Could it be could it have revolutionary potential, etc.? So we should project 1914 perhaps backwards
Forward and forwards. No, of course, in 1905 they knew that it was a revolutionary opportunity.
Right, and the bourgeoisie, the Russian bourgeoisie, a large portion of it had a defeatist mentality. So defeatism was actually quite popular in Russia. So it was actually kind of the opposite situation.
Yeah, and perhaps we can expand to bourgeois wars, Napoleonic wars. But anyway, also I wanted to bring in the anarchists in the discussion. I mean, there were nationalist anarchists in the First World War who were against the Bolsheviks and Lenin's position. But nowadays, you have the anarchists keeping the defeatist approach more warmly. For example, against the Iraq, US-Iraq, they would say the Baathists are reactionary, the Taliban are reactionaries in ways that the Leninists would not. So it seems like there is an opposite course, the anarchists from nationalism to the weak nations to...
The anarchists who supported the war in 1914 basically capitulated in the same terms as the Second International. I mean, that's what's interesting, is that, like syndicalists capitulated to the war in largely the same terms. And so that's why the Third International arises not only from a split within the Second International, but also from a split within the anarchists.
Yeah.
Right? Now it's different. In some ways, the anarchists now, like the Marxist left, they're less in a position of political responsibility, and so therefore it's pseudo-anarchism, the same way it's pseudo-Marxism, meaning these people aren't going to capitulate to anything because they're not really political to begin with. The anarchists before World War I were political enough to actually be faced with a political choice when World War I happened, in a way that, of course, nobody on the left is faced with that now.
A final point, that the explanation that Richard seemed to give was that revolution was not possible. This is how we have discourse. Because
You mean today?
No.
No.
Why this stance seems untenable? For example, Second World War or afterwards. Why is this untenable? What's the explanation? What I got from his comments, it was like revolution was not possible, so this stance was untenable. So I want some clarification on it.
Okay, I think that was misunderstood. I mean, I wasn't saying that. I think that the problem of the difference between the Second World War and the First World War is that the Second World War had an ideological character. Like, even if one accepted it as an inter-imperialist war, leaving aside the Soviet Union, the fact was that the imperialists on one side were bourgeois democratic, and they were allied to the Soviet Union, which was not seen by Kautsky as an imperialist power, against fascism. So in other words, you had Stalinism and bourgeois democracy on one side against fascism. So that changed the way most of the left, even the Trotskyists, saw it. And it's interesting that the Trotskyist position, which kind of waffled, right? So it was theoretically revolutionary defeatist, but it really wasn't. The section of the Trotskyist movement that most resisted that were the German Trotskyists, who said, and of course the only ones who were alive to comment were of course in exile. They said, look, you're delusional, no political opposition to Hitler is possible. The only way Hitler's ever going to be defeated is through military defeat by the Allied armies.
That's why the Frankfurt School signs on with the war, too.
Yeah, the Frankfurt School took the same approach. And that was, I think, one has to say, objectively a realistic assessment, which actually contradicted the assessment of Trotsky.
Pam?
I guess this is related, although maybe in a different level. You opened with talking about a defensive position versus an offensive position in relationship to the war and voting for war credits. Kautsky sort of like presenting the defensive self-preservation line, and Lenin and Luxemburg presenting the kind of offensive position. And there's a way in which, from what you're saying, it sounds like what Lenin and Luxemburg understood was that there was an inertia to the kind of self-preservation defense line. And it reminded me of two things, like obviously last night's panel, in which there was this sort of abdication of thinking about a project of freedom, and thus a kind of offensive, position, and the kind of inertia that grows out of that, and simply like defending the capacity for the human race to continue to exist
Right.
on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was also Tarek Shalabi's comments of Egypt, and he has this. He presented it at least as such, as saying that, well, the reason why we had to vote for Morsi was because we needed the remnants of the bourgeois state as the conditions under which a left could develop, and a military coup would dismantle that apparatus. And so we need to conceive of ourselves as advancing in steps, right? He kept on sort of presenting it in that way.
So Morsi
And-
defended the revolution.
Right, that in that way, like the defending Morsi's election was a way of preserving the remnants of the bourgeois state that would allow for such a left to even take place. And that in this formulation, which is not, it's not irrational. There's
No.
some truth
He said more than that. He said that if workers go out on strike in favor of the military, he would support them for going on strike, period.
for going on strike.
Not for the, not, in other words, it doesn't matter what their political goals are. It matters that they're, active. There is a rational kernel to that. There's a rational kernel to that.
But can I
But-
just
yeah,
finish my
uh-huh.
thought? Because I think that there is this question in the same way in which Richard sort of presenting the issue of World War II and, the kind of irrationality of saying, well, we have to have military defeatism or revolutionary defeatism against someone like Hitler, right? Like in the context of Egypt or something, right? Which Shalabi was like very much about remaining within the context of Egypt, but the left had to make concessions in order to get to the point where even the revolutionary defeatism as a line could be taken up. That like we didn't live in a moment in which this revolutionary defeatism made sense. And I don't know, I mean, in terms of how Platypus has conceived of itself in the past, we've talked about turning the forces of disintegration into like offensive, sort of
Turn a
advancing.
liability into an asset.
Yeah, and whether or not this is something that continues to inspire us in terms of the disintegration of the left, and and so. To the extent
So
that
maybe
we-
you mean something else, because we saw the anti-war movement and the end of the anti-war movement, the denouement, the election of Obama, as blows to the left. In other words, that the left, in becoming reanimated, actually collapses more completely. And that's just our estimation of the situation. And so it's not a question of whether we wish it to be the case or not. It's a question of we think that's the case. And so now what do we do with that, right? And then, of course, because we sign on to a strategy around that estimation, then we could claim to want it.
Right,
Right.
so the final question is, insofar as Platypus is not presenting a defensive position, a self-preservation position, right? That we are advancing some kind of offensive, advancement. Like, the character of that offensive advancement is what?
Okay, good point. I think that this might actually speak to the pre-political issue, actually. In other words, there's a way in which, this is the parallel with the CPGB, by the way. If you recall when Mike McNair of the CPGB spoke on the legacy of Trotskyism closing plenary panel a few years ago, what he said was, well, of course a revolutionary crisis today would only benefit the right, not the left. And so we shouldn't want it. Right? We shouldn't expect it, but we also shouldn't want it. Now, this gets around to another point that I've also been thinking about with respect to something, Pam, that you raised earlier about the division of labor and the, reconstituting the object of critique, this kind of idea that Platypus is doing something necessary but not sufficient. Absolutely. That, in fact, the prior history of the Second International is what informs the event of 1914. In other words, what we can say is that from Luxemburg and Lenin's perspective, their view is that, in fact, the growth of the workers' movement, and they understood the growth of the workers' movement purely in terms of the struggle for socialism, not in terms of a kind of corporatism, but that had contributed to the situation of imperialism and the inter-imperialist rivalry of the states. In other words, the Germany versus Britain, which is essentially what World War I is about. It's not about Germany versus Russia. It's about Germany versus Britain. It's about the British world order and the Germans' criminal attempt to reorder the world politically through violence. That's why it's a crime, right? That's why, you know, the British and the French, and you know, could simply claim that the Germans had committed a crime, because they had, because it's a crime in bourgeois society to try to change politics through violence. That the historical estimation is that the workers' movement had produced this crisis, and therefore was duty bound to see it all the way through. In other words, not to treat the war as an anomaly, but to treat the war as a potential political outcome of their own efforts. In other words, if the workers were going to organize in this way over the course of decades, then one potential result of that would be bringing the world to a crisis that could find expression through international war. Right? In other words, it's not a calamity that just descends from nowhere, but in fact that they, you know, that the workers were duty bound to make the revolution because in a sense they had produced the situation that could lead to the war. And in our estimation, so the question is, so a lot of the left has this idea, and it goes back to the Trotskyist left of the 30s, and some perhaps misestimations by Trotsky that we're talking about, that essentially Trotsky thought that the Third International and the remnant Second International could be split the way the Second International had been split in World War I. In other words, the World War II could split the Third International and the remnant Second International in the way that the First World War had split the Second International. And he just saw himself as, you know, holding on. Like, in other words, he thought that there were thousands of potential followers of the Fourth International in the Soviet Union, in the Allied countries, who were just waiting, like, only for conjunctural reasons they had not yet joined the Fourth International, but that the war would change things up. In the same way that the USPD, the Independent Social Democrats, the anti-war Social Democrats at the end of the First World War were split and the majority became communists in 1921. When is the Halle Conference? You know, the thing that CPGB carries on about. 1920, right. Spencer, Nate? Did you have a... I thought you...
Actually, you just made the point. I mean, the point that I was going to make was about the significance of claiming responsibility for the war, which is the point that you just made.
Okay,
Right?
good.
To say that Germany
Hold
was
on,
responsible.
Nikos behind you.
Without.
Okay, Nikos?
I would like to raise the attention mainly to the masses, because up till now we spoke of the stances of, let's say, the leadership of, or the supposed leadership of labor movement. But I think that the First World War was a great occasion to see how deeply rooted was the national sentiment, the national feeling in the masses.
Mm.
So the masses that before 1914 were considered as internationalists, as let's say the international fraternity of workers that had common interests. So they should altogether fight against their exploiters. So we saw then how brutally this illusion was destroyed by the facts. And I think as anti-nationalist militants, I would say that we have to take this very seriously in mind, because the nation is not something that it could be withered away so easily. And I think there's an illusion that common ideology, or even supposed common interests are enough to do the nation wither away. But we saw how fanatically the masses went and participated in this great massacre that was the First World War. And even after the war, the period rightly after the war was a period of great nation productivity, nation creation. The nations that were created in Europe after the fall of ancient empires, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and even in the Soviet Union, the newborn Soviet Union, because one of the first things that mainly contributed to the Bolsheviks' victory was the promise that Lenin made to the ethnicities that you're going to be liberated. So we see that this problem is really deeply rooted, and even until now it still.
Let me just. I want to respond to that because
Chris,
it's a
just
substantial point.
Two seconds to support that.
Uh-huh.
The Marxists, Lenin included,
Yeah.
were victims of the illusion on all the conventions before the World War I that there was no problem about this nationalism. They were thinking that.
Let's disaggregate things a little bit.
And just a
Yeah.
final remark.
Mhm.
And I think that we could even say that the nation was the necessary ground for the growth of workers' movement.
Okay, so this is, I would take exception to this very strongly. I think that the 20th century is a century of nationalism in a way that the 19th century was not, in fact. And so we have to parse out cause and effect, essentially, is what I would say. So I think that, first of all, the question of the workers supporting the war is tricky. That they were able to recruit, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds to be, very nationalistically minded as troops in the war is something quite different from saying that 30 or 40-year-old workers organized in the SPD supported the war. There's a question of whether the workers really supported the war or not. In other words, the workers as such, as they were constituted politically. And so I would say that, in other words, there was a cosmopolitan, not merely internationalist, but cosmopolitan working class culture among politicized workers prior to World War I that was actively destroyed in through the World War, and then that had consequences. I think that the German government's estimation, which is that the SPD was anti-war, but that it could be maneuvered into supporting the war, was a very fine-tuned, in other words, the historiography, that I can't cite, but that I've read with respect to this, is that literally the German government had this idea that there was a closing window of opportunity. That as the SPD grew, and also as Germany more generally became more kind of liberal and democratic minded, that essentially any hope of reordering Europe by military means would be progressively undermined. And they saw the fact that the labor unions, and they looked at the revisionist dispute, they paid very close attention to what was going on in the SPD, and they said, well, look, the fact that the SPD is evolving into a labor party, into a British Labor Party type formation, spells doom for us politically. In other words, their attitude was, if we don't find an excuse to launch a war in the next 10 years, we'll probably lose the ability to do so politically. And in other words, the war didn't happen over here, and then the SPD was over there, and the SPD, mistook the nationalism of the masses, which were somewhere over here. These are much more closely bound up phenomena in which literally the attitude was, what kind of piece on the playing field is the SPD militarily, right? And the way they disarmed the SPD militarily was to blackmail them with the threat of Russian invasion. And so it's very much about Germany, it's very much about the SPD, it's very much about the conjunctural circumstances of World War I. The fact that the British and the French could sign on and say we're fighting against the Huns, well, right? I mean, that the point of the matter is that none of the workers wanted the war. I would say that the working class.
Even Lenin was forced to admit that when disappointed from the fact, as Luxembourg also, that German proletariat did not rise to help a Russian revolution. Then his politics in the beginning of the 20s was even to flatter national the German national sentiment, in saying, in accusing the bad imperial
Versailles.
forces that imposed the Versailles Treaty. So, I mean, Lenin, who was a pragmatist and had a profound historical and social insight, he grasped that. I mean, because the war is not just made by the infantry and the youth that has of 20 years old. It's
Yeah, I wanted to respond to
If
that.
you have something quickly
Yeah,
to
very-
respond, and then
Because it's
go
connected
to
to the
Nate.
point that Chris made about Lenin and Luxemburg. So I think that I agree with what Chris said about nationalism and workers, and I think the point about Lenin and Luxemburg is interesting because both on the question of nationalism and on the general perception of the war. So I think you could say, Chris said Lenin had the cooler head. I think that's correct. I think that Lenin's insight into his own historical moment was more accurate than Luxemburg. The question and the problem for Platypus is that regression in a way makes Luxemburg look right. And this goes to the question of nationalism. So Lenin's response to nationalism and his understanding of the problem of nations and self-determination is, I think, basically a continuation of a kind of bourgeois democratic liberal project, which is very similar to Marx and Engels. In the present climate, sort of having experienced the 20th century, there's a way in which Luxemburg's anti-nationalism seems more accurate. It seems to us like she's the one who was more perceptive and was right. And I think that one has to separate oneself from the sense that we know what happened. Like I think there's a way in which there can be an optical illusion about what happened. I mean, there was this crazy line in the discussion about the Ukraine, Putin saying, oh, the Bolsheviks just like irrationally gave away historic Russian territory to the Ukrainians. I mean, in the context of what the Bolsheviks thought they were doing, they thought they were doing something perfectly reasonable and democratic, like, yeah, the Ukrainians are a different nationality, they should have self-determination, within the concept of an overarching socialist federation. Now you can say, looked at from the light of history, that was a naive belief. But it became a naive belief.
Right.
It wasn't a naive belief at the time. It was a very rational, reasonable, democratic belief rooted in the extension through Marxism and socialist revolution of basic liberal ideas.
Nate, and then I think Cam. I think that's the order. Nate, yeah.
Sure. I mean, I guess can I come back? I mean, in terms of like the Second World War not shaping up in the same way as the first, and I wanted to kind of raise this earlier, and we've kind of already to a certain extent addressed it, but I think maybe pushing us like raise certain other issues. Is that there's like, for instance, in like Lenin's imperialism, that like focus on like how the growth of the workers' movement itself is playing a role in how a kind of crisis like in society at large is playing out, and how that's like different from in World War II, because it's so Trotsky calls like Stalin the like great organizer of defeats for the working class, and it's like that actually like should actually be in a certain sense a kind of peculiar phrase, because like ostensibly, so I mean like this is like a period of huge growth for like the Communist Party and all these other things, so it's like on like a very so he means that like obviously in like a kind of like deeper sense. It's like not kind of like an obvious necessarily sort of diagnosis, and so it's what does he mean by that? Is that like it's sort of how is the workers' movement growing at this period, which I think gets to a question of nationalism. I mean, like I think of like I've been to the socialist equality parties, like from the Tsar to Lenin, right? Or
The film?
where they were like showing that, and there was like a very old, I think, Greek like Stalinist in the crowd, or someone who's very like sympathetic to Stalin, who like was like, well, like
When they screened it here.
yeah, when
Right.
they screened it here, he talked, and like the SCP of course was like, no, Stalin's bad, but like there were like reasons that they gave for that. Their like rejoinder to him was like exactly what like a kind of like liberal like person would say. It's like, oh, he like you did like all of these different like crimes, like focusing on like degree killed, which obviously were crimes, but like from like a kind of a leftist perspective, like what part of what makes those crimes is a question of like what the goal of that was. In other words, like ultimately it's a question of like what was all the revolutionary work leading up to that sort of coming to, and it was very clear to me from like the older kind of Stalinist guy that it's like for him it was this question of it's like it was like revolution was thought of because it was thought of in purely national terms, and you kind of like adjudicated it in terms of those goals. It then became this kind of like balancing game. It's like, well, like these terrible things did happen, but like there was industrialization and like these things changed, and like the Soviet Union became like a world power, and all these other things. And so there's a complete kind of liquidation of like how the revolution was initially pursued as like being the spark to create world revolution. It was instead thought of purely in terms of like a kind of nationalistic, certain kind of like national goals. Which so that was I guess something I wanted to. So I guess for me, maybe in terms of like the 19th and 20th century, maybe a question is like sort of whether one's more nationalistic or not, like kind of a changed role of nationalism and how that's bound up with also like massification as a phenomenon. So I guess those are just some things I wanted to raise.
Ken, do you have a question?
Yeah, I
And then Tom.
just kind of wanted to like think about 1914 in relationship to the present a bit.
Mm-hmm.
About in terms of what's changed. Like one of the things that seemed immediately apparent to me about what's changed is like the nature of militarism itself is different.
Can you speak up? Speak up?
Oh, sorry, I'm kind of I guess I'm just
Nature of militarism.
Like there's kind of the joke that like the anti-Vietnam protests didn't end when the war ended; they ended when the draft ended. So there was that 3-year period where they were like kind of consolidating things with Vietnam, but like the movement there ended. So like that was just something that I was kind of trying to think about, because like when you get to the issue of what Chris was talking about, which I think is like political responsibility, it becomes like very understandable compared to the present why like the Social Democrats would flinch, to use the Spartacist term, when confronted with the question of state power and civil war. Whereas like now, like for independent Marxist politics, like there's the process that happens in World War II is a huge part of it, of maintaining these positions in the absence of actually having like an organized social force. So like Trotskyism is a good example there of like what it meant for them to be defeatist. But like one of the things that I read that was very startling to me, coming from someone politicized in the present, is that if you were a Trotskyist in Britain or somewhere else, you weren't allowed to dodge the draft. You had to go into the army and fight and try to organize people in the army.
By your own party. In other words, your own
Yeah.
party obligated you. And the Spartacists had the same position on the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
which is you must go with your class.
it's an entirely unthinkable.
Oh no, it's not
Right.
unthinkable. You will go with your class. Platypus will insist.
But I just mean, in terms of the way like the anti-war movement worked, the idea that you would
No, because this-
you would try to
This
move
came,
the US Army.
this came to my mind with respect to Tariq Shalabi. And Tariq Shalabi spoke, of the Egyptian Revolutionary Socialists, spoke in some ways more clearly on Thursday night at Loyola than on Friday night at our own opening plenary. And what he said was that there he raised the issue. He was a little bit more political because they're the Trotskyists, and he was talking about the Stalinists in Egypt, and how the Stalinists in Egypt oriented towards the military in a way that the Trotskyists had oriented towards the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. And, I just made a point, like, immediately afterwards, we were talking afterwards, and I just made the point. I think that also maybe Teo Yorgos and I were riding the train, and I made the point there as well, that maybe the Stalinist position of orienting towards the military was the leftist position between those two. Because splitting the military is actually a much more reasonable tactic and practically feasible matter than splitting an ideological movement like the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, like people who join the Muslim Brotherhood are making a different kind of commitment than people who have to do obligatory military service in the Egyptian
That's
military.
because they think that the Muslim Brotherhood has anti-capitalist.
I know, it's
That's
absurd.
why.
But but in that respect, I think that we inherit a lot. Again, one of my main sort of points was it's not pacifism. It's not pacifism, meaning the Marxist revolutionary defeatism is not pacifism, and in some ways it could be considered as a kind of a pro-war perspective in certain
Absolutely.
respects.
That was my point.
And we used to make the point that the anti-war movement around Iraq was actually a pro-war movement, but in a completely different way, meaning that they wouldn't know what to do with themselves if there wasn't a war going on, right? But more charitably, of course, they're a pro-war movement in the sense that they welcome the potential political crisis of the war, right? Which then raises the issue of could anyone benefit from that except the right? Tom.
Okay, I wanted to go back to the issue, I guess, which is still sort of lingering around of both defeatism and then sort of instrumental thinking. And there's a bad way that this is remembered in sort of the memory of Trotskyism, and even has come up here, which is, Trotsky wasn't a defeatist in World War II, actually. There was an odd thing called the proletarian military policy that was not to call for the defeat of one's own country in inter-imperialist war, but to try to organize soldiers' councils to take control of the military. And so there was in the Janet Beale article about Bookchin, this moment where she says, these young Trotskyists are going to factories and are preaching revolutionary defeatism and being sort of laughed away. And actually a common criticism of Trotsky at that time was the opposite, that he'd become a social chauvinist. And you can read these writings in, say, 1940, where he's saying, we want to preserve the good aspects of American democracy that are threatened by fascism. So there's a way now that this, in the memory of Trotskyism in the left, becomes obscured, just as Trotsky, incessant, all seasons revolutionary defeatist. And so it's interesting to say the Spartacists repudiate the proletarian military policy.
That's right.
And
They're
it's,
consistent.
defeatism or bust, this was a mistake. That then, actually, at the end of this sort of 1914 to 1945 long period is, Trotsky's thinking not just as a moral principle of we must, our nation, your nation must be defeated, but actually what, in the absence of the capacity to split the Third International and the remnants of the Second International, now one has to do, which now you said, well, splitting the military is a much more viable policy, right? That's what he was trying to do. It never came to anything, but yes, there's a capacity to think instrumentally that's not the moral principle of defeat.
Right. So we should wrap up now. The pizza is here. Donnie will coordinate. It's out on the 13th floor?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's on the 13th floor,
And so we're going to take a meal break now with the pizza and then come back for the organizational meeting at
4.
4.
Can I just make a pitch? Those of you who haven't